Okay, so it looks like we finally know how Akechi survived. Apparently, a hole was blasted into Shido's palace when it started sinking, and Akechi was convinced by the voice in his head to start free falling. Sorry, that's not the... I try to lighten up the mood, but it kind of clashes with the tone of the story, doesn't it? Anyway, let's move on. The Phantom Thieves gathered around him in their private orbits. Haru, Makoto, and Yusuke made up the inner ring, standing in a rough semicircle around the sofa like a trifecta of judges. Ryuji, Futaba, and An had taken their places on the chair of the bed, with Morgana hanging back on the table by the stairs. If you're hearing background noises because of the fan in the background. Akechi bent over in his seat like a penitent, laced fingers hanging between his knees. The act of speaking seemed to have exhausted him. That's all, he finished. When I came to, I was in the Dead Sea. The remains of Shido's palace were in the distance. I suppose I'd been washed away by all that water. He raised his head. You all know the rest. I've never heard of a persona acting on its own like that before, Morgana said. Robin Hood OP. Nerf, please. Futaba didn't sound particularly invested in the conversation. She'd hunched over her laptop before Akechi had even begun his story and hadn't looked up since. Yeah, that's kind of like what Futaba would say. I first gained that power when I met Akira. It's probable that Robin Hood was born from my bond with him, as questionable as it might have been. Akechi shrugged. Struggled? Like... We all know firsthand how powerful Akira is. Maybe that goes for personas forged from his connections as well. In any case, I often believed he'd been the one who saved me in a way. Though after a while down there, those feelings darkened somewhat. Turned resentful. It's why I reacted so shamefully when we reunited. And then he whooped your butt. Futaba added. Again. As for that hole popping up, I can buy it. My mother's notes never mention what happens when a palace collapses, probably because no one's supposed to survive it. Akechi was at the very lowest point of that palace. If some kind of connecting point was going to open between it and the Sea of Unconscious, it'll logically happen there. Her mouth twitched like she'd remembered something amusing. You can always fall a little further. What about the voice? An asked. Sounded like it had a real stick up its ass, Ryuji grumbled. Kind of reminds me of Captain Kidd back when he woke up in my head, except he wasn't such a dick about it. You sure Loki wasn't giving you a little pep talk? I don't know. I never heard it again. I experienced the headaches from time to time, but I thought they were just from my prolonged stay in the Dead Sea. They were never as intense as that first one. He gingerly touched his temple, as if pained just by the memory of it. My head burned. You look much better now, at least, Haru told him. He attempted to smile at that. Mr. Sakura's coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. Either way, you're here now, Makoto said, crossing her arms. You fell, but you came back. Now the question is what you can do for us. Because I'll be honest, I'm at a loss as to our next move. We were outmatched by this enemy of ours, even with Akira on our side. Correct, said Akechi. So our next logical step is to recover Akira. He straightened up and regarded them all. Haru was right. He did look better. He was still horribly pallid and gaunt, but that lifeless glaze had fled from his eyes. Allow me to make one thing clear. My credentials as a detective may have been false, but my knowledge of the cognitive world is not. Between my unsavory work for Shido and my extended period in the Dead Sea, I may very well know more about the metaverse than anyone in this room, save for Morgana. Therefore, I ask that you lend the appropriate weight to what I'm about to say. We wouldn't have kept you around if we didn't think you had something useful to offer, Morgana said. He visibly struggled not to be flattered by Akechi's compliment. So spit it out already. Very well. Here are several observations regarding the adversary we have encountered in the Dead Sea. He remained undetectable by Futaba's scans until he wished to make his presence known to us. He dives into the Sea of Souls, often dragging shadows with him, and emerges the same way. Moreover, he does not kill the shadows that he captures. Their owners would become brain dead if that were the case, whereas the victims of paranoia syndrome experience a high degree of mental activity. From this, we can deduce that he travels between the Dead Sea and somewhere else in the larger Sea of Souls, and keeps the shadows within the same location to which he travels. The sea is just a big mashup of everyone's thoughts, Morgana said. It shouldn't have a defined place to keep anything. Where could they all be? In the most obvious place you can think of. Who knows what can be hidden within the fortress of the heart? All of the captured shadows, and Akira, are most likely detained within the fortress of our enemy's heart, said Akechi. They are trapped inside his palace. A long, heavy silence rolled out. Akechi sighed and shut his eyes. Very well. Who'd like to be the first to tell me that's impossible? It is impossible! Morgana shouted, hackles rising. We've all seen the persona that guy totes around. A persona is born when someone accepts their innermost self, which means no shadow. No shadow means no palace ruler, and no ruler means no palace. Exactly, he said. Morgana blinked, taken aback. So, let us examine that persona. Don't you all think it's a little unusual? It's extraordinarily powerful, that much is certain, said Yusuke. He didn't really use it the way we use ours either, Aunt said. We pretty much just summon ours whenever we need them, but he never put his persona away until Makoto knocked his lights out. I mean, how could he have even fought us himself if he wanted to? His hands were literally tied. There's more, Akechi said. Our personas are the incarnate form of the masks we wear. When we summon them, the mask of our thief garb disappears, and that mask is often reflected on the persona itself. But Iago's mask bears no resemblance at all to that of his owner. What's more, that crude mask he wore didn't burn away at all. So what? Ryuji asked. You think the dude's wearing another mask underneath? We got a Scooby situation going on here? That would be quite the interesting thing if Scooby-Doo existed in the Persona universe. At least in Persona 4. Imagine a crossover where the investigation team come across the Scooby Gang. Not the Buffy the Vampire Slayer Scooby Gang, the actual Scooby Gang from Scooby-Doo, Mystery Incorporated. That is a possibility, he dryly replied. There's also no evidence that his clothing follows the same rules that ours does. After all, I myself have bent those rules somewhat with my alternate garb for Robin Hood. Still, that persona is remarkable enough so that I don't believe we can rule out the existence of a palace by his presence alone. It doesn't appear to bear the same connection to the heart of its owner. And, he added, there's another reason. If my hypothesis is correct, it means that Akira will have been imprisoned in a place that our enemy controls absolutely. where he holds... pardon me. Where he holds every advantage. And that is a very good thing. How the hell is that? Ryuji began, and then he stopped. Akechi was smiling, thin and unpleasant. It was an uncomfortable echo of the smug villain he'd acted when they'd all fought against him. During my career under Shido, I became quite good at discerning people's weaknesses, he said. And this individual's weakness is easy to see. Consider his tactics. He initially tried to capture us all in a show of overwhelming force. But even then, he always maintained his distance, leaving all offense to Iago. When we finally took the offensive ourselves, he was felled with just a single blow, at which point he resorted to a hit-and-run strategy. As Sakamoto pointed out last night, he feigned capturing me to strike directly at Akira. Somehow he had discerned that Akira was the leader and mastermind of the Phantom Thieves, and made sure we all knew that he had been captured. In short, after he actually took a hit, he chose to instead disable and demoralize us, and ensure that he had every advantage should we ever encounter him again. These are not the actions of someone undefeatable. He leaned forward. Understand? Our enemy is not invincible. He's frail, and he's vulnerable, and he's afraid of us. So that may be so, Makoto said uncertainly. But it still doesn't guarantee that he has a palace. Well, it should be easy enough to check. All we need to do is find an appropriate name for the Metanath. He stopped and looked around. The others' faces had become concerned, almost pitying. Is something wrong? The Metanath's gone, Futaba said. Yeah, dude. It vanished along with mementos after we capped Yellowmouth. Where the hell were you when... Oh, right. My bad. A moment, Yusuke said. Akechi's body was effectively kept in stasis during his time in the Dead Sea. Perhaps that applies to his phone as well. It may have been spared from the purge. Let's find out, Akechi said. He pulled out his cell phone and pressed the power button. There was an expectant silence. Will Akechi need to charge his phone up? The silence continued. Akechi cleared his throat awkwardly. Could someone lend me a charge cable? Called it! They regarded one another. The dramatic atmosphere in the room had been punctured somewhat. That was when Futaba stood up, producing a fistful of cables from one of her coat pockets. They dangled between her fingers like party streamers. Got you covered, she said. Always be prepared. She walked over to the couch and sat down beside Akechi. Everyone stared at her like she just leapt into a snake pit. Here, charge off my laptop. This is the one for your phone, I think. Yeah, it'll fit. There you go. Turn it around. You've got to turn it... Here, let me... Okay, no, you got it. Finally. Akechi slotted the USB port home. A fire engine red flush had started to creep up from his collar. It's been a while, he explained, lamely. Glad to see you're taking charge, Futaba, said Makoto. She then stiffened and slapped a hand over her face. Oh God. Pun not intended. It's okay. Hey, said Futaba. I got bored of being sad. Decided to get angry instead. She looked over at Akechi and the flat sheen of her glasses transfixed him. You. Find me an enemy so that I may destroy them. Yes. First we have to see if... Aha! He held up the phone to the rest of them. That familiar red and black eye was emblazoned on its screen. Success. Haru clapped her hands together. Wonderful! Now we just need a name. Which is easier said than done, Ryuji said. We don't know shit about this guy. Akechi said, Japanese, likely male, between the ages of 15 and 20, Tokyo resident, will have been comatose or otherwise incapacitated since last summer. Yo, what? I've heard him speak. He's not talkative, but what he did say was fluent Japanese, and I have little reason to believe he'd use anything other than his native tongue. Gender is a little ambiguous due to his clothing, but age and build are easy enough to guess by the look of him. The Tokyo part is a hopeful shot in the dark. Akira said that this problem emerged as a result of Yaldabaoth's demise, so it's reasonable to assume that, even if our enemy's influence is global, he himself would be based in ground zero, as it were. The most important part is the coma. He clasped his phone to his heart, as if swearing upon it. We only know of 2 ways to enter the Dead Sea. Physically, as you did, or mentally, as Akira did. Akira came there by projecting his cognition directly into the region, which also left his body comatose. Without the Metanav or Morgana at his disposal, our enemy most likely arrived via a similar method. If we can find someone with these criteria, in this region, who fell comatose just prior to the earliest reported paranoia syndrome cases, it's likely we'll have our culprit. And what were you saying about your detective credentials being false? Seriously, those are genuine detective skills right there. Haru nodded. Mr. Iwai said that some of the first victims were Yakuza who fell ill in September. Understandable that criminals would already have manifested shadows, I suppose. So what now? Makoto asked. Behind her, An's eyes widened. She turned away from the group, walking to the stairs. Do we search hospital records? Futaba groaned, long and loud. Urgh! Hospitals are such a pain. Their records are always an unholy mess. Some of them still have analog components for crying out loud. Does that mean you can't do it? Ryuji said, and immediately wavered under the look in Futaba's eye. I'll pretend I didn't hear that. If everything Akechi said is right, it shouldn't take more than a few hours. But if I have to expand our search criteria... God, if I have to search the whole of Japan, we'll lose a lot of time. Especially since paranoia syndrome's thrown medical record... keeping out of whack to begin with. Thrown medical record keeping out of whack to begin with. Sorry, I had to repeat myself. I'll start by... Hi, Dr. Takemi! An's cheery greeting knifed through the room. All heads turned to her, but she didn't seem to notice any of them, including Futaba's molten glare. She was leaned up against the wall, her phone to her ear. Tai Takemi, if you're in a pitch, just call Dr. Tai Takemi. This is on Takamaki from... Okay, yes, I know that you're... I wouldn't call unless it was important. Her voice flattened out. Yes, there is. I know you're busy, so I'll make it short. That patient you talked about, the one who didn't have the pain response. What was their name? This got everyone's attention. Even Akechi moved to the edge of his seat. Yes, I know it's a violation of... Oh, well that's good to know. Spell that for me? Okay. Yes, this should be helpful. I'll keep in touch. You too. Goodbye. Oh yeah, Takemi mentioned way back when that there was a patient who didn't respond to pain. She hung up and stepped forward, a determined set to her jaw. Akechi, bring up the metanav, please. He did so. An took a deep breath and said, Target, Seki Shimizu. Candidate found, chirped the metanav. An was not graceful in victory. She whooped, she hollered, she fist-pumped with hazardous enthusiasm. She gathered high-fives from several of her less reserved fellows, including a double palm slap from Ryuji that left him shaking the numbness out of his hands afterward. She flopped down next to him on Akira's bed, legs primly crossed, grinning ear to ear. Back when we were gathering intel, Takemi said she checked up on a patient who ended up like Akira, she explained. Just had to get the name. Nice one, Goro. Your theory was right on the money. Yes. He hastily rubbed at his mouth to hide the smile. Not to ruin the mood, but the name is often the easiest part of the investigation. What of the palace location? Unfortunately, I can't guess anything else about this individual. Seki Shimizu, age 15, resides in the Bunkyo district. Entering for second year of Kosei Academy. Was found unresponsive in his room on August 29th, admitted to St. Luke's on the same evening. Futaba's face was bathed in the light from her laptop screen. She pecked relentlessly at the keys. Blood type RH+, no prior medical history. Parents Yuichi Shimizu and Azusa Shimizu, employed as logistics manager and freelance web designer respectively. Family credit history doesn't show anything remarkable. Pulling up the GPS tracking movement from his phone. Boring. Home to school and back again. Even over the summer he didn't go anywhere that interesting. She gripped the laptop screen. That's all for now. They all shuffled uneasily in place. The Phantom Thieves investigations were always a little invasive, but this was on a whole other scale. Futaba had just plunged her hand into their target's personal life and ripped out its beating heart. She ripped it out like the bad guy from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where he ripped out the poor guy's heart before burning him alive, which set the heart on fire. Moving on! Ryuji spoke first. You telling me that the guy wrecking shit all over the world is a damn 15-year-old? I was 15 when we boom headshotted the god, Futaba said. Food for thought. And I'm proof enough that age is no prerequisite for committing atrocities, said Akechi. His character aside, we should focus on the next keyword. For now, let's try to brute force it. He held up his phone. Any suggestions? Let's try the obvious ones first. Makoto leaned in. School. Kosei Academy. Conditions have not been met. In times like these, I wish I were not so oblivious to my fellow students, Yusuke said. I do not recall anyone by that name. Don't worry about it now, Yusuke. Back to guessing. Library. Hospital. Tokyo Metro. Bunkyo. Conditions have not been met. I forgot how much I hated that freaking voice, Ryuji growled. Let's try places that someone his age would like to go, Haru said. Arcade. Cafe. Conditions have not been met. Conditions have not been met. Karaoke bar? Conditions have not been met. I'm sorry, I'm still a little out of touch for these things. Conditions have not been met. The metanav droned. Maybe we should think bigger, Morgana said. Tokyo? Japan even? Conditions have not been met. Ryuji let out a series of frustrated noises that the meta-nav didn't even consider a response. This sucks! Sure, we pegged the guy's name, but he's still practically a nobody. It could just be he read about online or something. Without more info, we're practically gonna have to guess everywhere in the world. Candidate found. Ryuji Sakamoto is a genius. Akechi nearly dropped the phone. Ryuji gaped, the color draining from his face. No effing way, he breathed. Akechi turned the phone towards him. Target, Sekishimizu. Location, the world. Candidate found. That's insane, Morgana said. Shido had the most advanced distortion I thought possible, and it barely encompassed Japan. How can a sick high schooler have the entire world for a palace? More importantly, what sort of distortion could affect such a large area? Akechi looked up at them. I'm afraid I have nothing to contribute this time. How long has this been going for? Okay, now is about time that I stop, but I'll continue this soon. Tomorrow.